Okay, now, sorry. Usually we don't talk specifically about the underlying ethics of our practice, but I wanted to talk this morning about what I'm calling values and well-being. And it really has to do with this question of, how do we walk this path that we all come together to practice? By what values do we live that are congruent with the path? Because without a strong ethical foundation, I mean, ethics were a huge part of what the Buddha taught. And without those, our practice really can kind of get away from us and not be terribly constructive. And it's why three of the Eightfold Path that the Buddha taught are the ethical foundations: a wise speech, wise action, and wise livelihood. And then we have the Brahma Viharas, the so-called heavenly abodes: compassion, loving kindness, equanimity, and sympathetic joy. The four of those all contain positive values. So that's the topic I want us to dig into a little bit this morning. And our values are the foundation, both conscious and unconscious, the ethics on which our practice rests. No ethics, no path. Distinction between our outside expressed priorities, like the decisions by which we live our lives, and our inner priorities. And ideally, we want those to be congruent. Values typically are internal, but we manifest them externally. Philip Moffat, some of you know, wrote Dancing with Life. Our book group did that book, the first book we did, says that people who pay attention to inner priorities or values are more effective in their lives. They guide us in how we implement our day-to-day outward behavior, our outward priorities. So for example, on a daily basis, we try to refrain from thoughts, words, or actions that cause suffering, our own and that of others. We're supported in our internal and physical well-being by our values. They bring consistency and continuity to our lives. When we're living consistent with our values, we don't have to justify, rationalize, defend our actions, make excuses for our bad behavior, whatever. So, for example, the five lay precepts of not lying, not stealing, not using intoxicants, not having misbehaving sexually, not killing, are again part of the ethical foundation. So the Buddha really infiltrated or established his practice on a strong ethical foundation. So I want to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the values that are important to the practice that help us live our lives with authenticity and with greater satisfaction and less suffering. The first is wise speech. This is one of the three, the ethical basket of the Eightfold Path. Be truthful in what we say, ideally, and speak with compassion, and express even difficult topics with as much kindness as possible. And this is where we really need to be aware of the influence of our ego, the way it gets in the way of our living authentically and living and practicing wise speech. When our ego strives for acceptance, approval, and popularity, sometimes that's contrary to our authenticity, contrary to our well-being. It's not who we really are, it's who we want to present ourselves as. So honesty, kindness, and compassion should inform our actions, ideally, rather than the ego, which is maintaining this, need for validation and popularity and all that. In other words, we want kindness to be central to all that we do and say. And I don't mean that in a transactional way. You're kind to me, so I'm going to be kind to you, quid pro quo. Kindness is not necessarily niceness, okay? Niceness can be polite, and this is, I think, particularly true of those of us raised in the South. Niceness can be polite but inauthentic. Oh, what a lovely something, and it's just kind of not really sincere. Kindness is authentic and heartfelt, even sometimes when it involves saying things other people may not want to hear. Okay. For example, giving difficult feedback to a friend or loved one when we feel we have to say something important, even if it's difficult for them to hear. That can be an important part of wise speech. It can be an important part of authentic speech. But it needs to be done in a compassionate way, especially with those who are suffering, but we want to convey to them that something is awry. What this reflects is making relatedness and connection a priority in our lives. And I mean genuine relatedness, genuine connection, not just superficial niceness. Okay. By which I mean we know that we are all part of something larger than ourselves, that we're all interconnected. And that asks of us in the Buddha's teaching, asks of us to interact authentically with compassion, but sometimes with honesty, which can often be challenging. So when we think of interconnection, we think of all the people that contribute to our well-being, all the people that, for instance, grow our food, harvest our food, transport our food, prepare our food, put it on the shelf, whatever. Having a sense of connection to others is a antidote to the ego. It breaks the aloneness that so many of us suffer from, that's so much a part of this human experience. The ego in its selfishness can create tremendous isolation, tremendous aloneness. When we set it aside and seek genuine, authentic connection, I think it's a much easier, greater path to true contentment. It helps us find a way to express our deepest values. So, we might want to, excuse me, feed our spirit, seek experiences of awe, practice right livelihood, which is the next aspect of the three in the ethical basket. Aligning values with our work, whether that's work for our survival and sustenance, or volunteer work, or whatever. Sorry, excuse me. Seek out people who share our values, who practice right livelihood, avoiding toxic people, avoiding toxic media. All of this is part of right livelihood. How do we go about sustaining ourselves, and do we do it in an ethical and value-based way? There's so much of our culture that doesn't practice right livelihood, that wants to win at all costs, step on other people to make a lot of money. I mean, all the things that we see that are so contrary to the values that the Buddha asks us to practice. And then third, lot-wise action, maintaining a healthy life balance, spending time on the important things in our lives, knowing what is important and what is not important, using discernment there, know how to spend our time and energy and what's not wise to do. And that might involve productive work, physical activity, learning, relating to others, giving our lives meaning, not just spending countless hours, on the internet, wasting time, not engaging in negative uses of our energy, which can be so depleting. Wise action usually involves opening our hearts. It usually involves, being open to the world, being open to others, continuing to learn and grow both personally and professionally at every stage of life. Because people who are growing in that way tend to thrive. They tend to have greater contentment. Because success doesn't just mean worldly, material success. It means success at the level of our relationships, success at the level of our wise livelihood, wise action. Being a lifelong learner is a value that we might aspire to, set an intention to. It applies equally to our relationships. It applies to our parenting, to our friendships, to maintaining our own well-being, to walking this path. And part of that is being present in our life moment to moment, so we have the awareness to practice these value-based values of ethics. In other words, showing up wholeheartedly for life, not being on autopilot. When we go through life on autopilot, we're not necessarily making wise choices. We're not necessarily living by our values. The other problem, and I alluded to this the other day, is when we're on autopilot, we're much more likely to be in reactive mode. Thinking, acting without thinking, not taking responsibility for our actions. So we make wise choices. We make wise choices in how we take care of ourselves. You know, diet, exercise, sleep, relaxation, all of that, all aspects of self-care are part of wise action. So by clarifying these values, by practicing the precepts and the ethical components of the Eightfold Path, by practicing the Brahma Viharas, we live our practice. We live our values. And we never want to lose sight of that. We never want to lose sight of the fact that values and ethics underlie this practice. And without them, it's kind of a hollow exercise. So let me stop there and we will talk about it. Oh, two housekeeping things real quick before